Hey guys, tonight we're not going to some dusty castle or plague pit, at least, not right away. Tonight we're looking around your own life. Your workday, your manners, your dinner table, even the little words you say without thinking and realizing just how medieval you still are. You might think you live in a modern world, scrolling through glowing rectangles and talking to robots. But the truth is, you're still ruled by the same strange habits and rules that shaped life 1,000 years ago. The Middle Ages never ended. They just put on Wi-Fi. Before we start unearthing all the bizarre ways the medieval mind still quietly runs our lives, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a candle. If you're listening from your bed, let your phone rest beside you. Let that blue light fade into something warmer, softer. This story isn't about cold history, it's about the ghosts of habits that cling to us like old cobwebs. And by the end of tonight, you might see that so much of what you do every single day, from shaking hands to saying bless you, comes straight from centuries when people thought bad weather meant God was angry and forks were the devil's idea. But before we get lost in superstition and scandal, I'm curious. Where are you listening from? Are you tucked away in a quiet apartment, the hum of traffic outside your window? Or maybe in a small house in the countryside, where the only sounds are crickets and the occasional rustle of wind? Wherever you are, imagine for a moment that the world around you begins to blur and fade. The lamp on your nightstand flickers like a candle. Your phone's glow becomes the soft shimmer of firelight. And slowly, you're back somewhere in the Middle Ages, though you might not realize it yet. See, the strangest thing about history is not how much has changed, but how much hasn't. You wake up every morning to an alarm clock, you drag yourself to work, you spend hours typing, building, replying, repeating. Then you come home, eat, maybe pray or scroll, and collapse into bed, ready to do it all again. You think that's modern life, but medieval monks invented it. They were the first people organized enough to measure time precisely, and the last people patient enough to live by bells. The rhythm of your entire day, the 9 to 5, the lunch hour, even the weekend, was written in their cloisters centuries ago. It's almost funny, isn't it? Every time your phone alarm goes off, it's really an echo of a monastery bell. Every meeting you rush to is just another canonical hour. And somewhere, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the chanting. That's where we'll begin tonight, in the quiet corridors of medieval monasteries, where time itself was born, and where the world's first workers began to trade freedom for order. But we'll get to that soon. First, let's ease into the mood, because tonight's story isn't just a list of odd facts. It's a slow unraveling of how superstition, ritual, and fear turned into the ordinary. It's about how something as innocent as sneezing became a spiritual emergency, how the fork was once condemned as sinful, how black clothing turned mourning into performance art, and how our politeness, our sirs and ma'ams, are really just echoes of submission whispered across centuries. It's all still here, hiding in plain sight. Every polite smile, every line you wait in, every rule you never question, they all have roots in medieval thinking. Even your weekends, those precious, fragile hours of freedom, exist because medieval peasants needed a break from endless work, and priests needed an audience on Sundays. The past isn't gone. It's your calendar, your dining table, your office. So, before we start time traveling properly, take a deep breath. You don't need to imagine kings or castles just yet. Think instead about the rules that quietly guide your day. Why do you wake up when you do? Why do you sit the way you sit, eat the way you eat, talk the way you talk? Why do you shake hands, bow your head, or bless someone when they sneeze? None of it is modern. All of it has a story. And those stories, well, they're ridiculous, sacred, and deeply human. They were born in candlelit monasteries, shouted through taverns, and whispered in confessionals. They spread not through science, but through habit, passed down like family recipes nobody remembers the origin of. They survived plagues, revolutions, even the internet. And now, they're sitting quietly beside you, waiting to be noticed. If you're new here, welcome. If you've joined me before, welcome back. You already know how this goes. I'll tell the stories slowly, so your mind can drift between the words. You might even fall asleep partway through, and that's okay. That's the point. Because these aren't stories meant to keep you awake, they're stories meant to settle, cur you, to remind you that even in our loudest, busiest world, history is still humming softly in the background. By the end of tonight's journey, We'll wander through monasteries, markets, taverns, and funerals. We'll peek into candlelit kitchens where forks were feared. We'll eavesdrop on monks inventing your morning routine. We'll step into a medieval tavern full of drunken knights to see where the bachelor party began. We'll walk through funeral processions, dining halls, and dark confessionals to uncover how the most ordinary parts of modern life began as acts of faith, fear, or rebellion. So, take one last look at the glow of your screen, then let it fade. Picture instead a single candle flame flickering gently against a stone wall. The room smells of wax and wood smoke. Somewhere outside, bells echo across the hills. A few voices murmur in Latin, too tired to mean every word. And as you settle into that sound, the story begins. Because tonight, we're going to strip away the illusion of modernity and see what's left underneath. The truth is, you're still medieval. The way you eat, the way you work, the way you mourn, greet, and rest. Every polite good morning and bless you is a ghost from a world that refused to die. And that's where we'll start at the first bell, in a cold monastery, where a young monk stirs in the darkness, unsure whether he's waking for God or for another round of obedience. Now, dim the lights a little more, and listen. The bells are about to ring. You wake before dawn to the sound of bells. Not the soft digital chime of your phone, but heavy bronze ones echoing across misty fields. The air is cold enough to bite, and the smell of damp stone fills the room. You're lying on a straw mattress in a monastery cell the size of a broom cupboard, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that feels more like a punishment than a comfort. Somewhere beyond the wall, footsteps shuffle. Another bell rings. This time, you can't ignore it. It's time for matins, the first prayer of the day. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and touch your bare feet to the icy floor. Every instinct tells you to crawl back under the blanket, but obedience is the rule here. You're not supposed to think about comfort. You're supposed to synchronize your soul with God's clock, and God, it turns out, keeps terrible hours. Outside your small window, you can see the faint orange glow of torches. Figures in dark robes drift through the courtyard, silent except for the occasional sneeze or cough swallowed by the fog. You join them, following the line of brothers toward the chapel. The sound of the bell is constant now, pulsing through the mist like a heartbeat. It marks the beginning of a new day, though day is generous. It's closer to midnight. Inside, the air is thick with candle smoke and breath. 100 voices rise and fall in unison, chanting words you only half understand. The rhythm is slow, hypnotic. The music doesn't lift you, it traps you. Every note is another brick in the wall between you and sleep. But that's the point. Monastic life isn't about pleasure. It's about surrender. You don't own your time. You rent it to God in hourly installments. And here's where it all began: your modern schedule. Long before office meetings, lunch breaks, and deadlines, there was this: the endless rhythm of bells. The monks divided the day into canonical hours, each with a specific name and prayer: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. To an outsider, they sound like rejected Harry Potter spells, but in the Middle Ages, they were sacred markers that governed every breath of the day. The bells ruled everything. You didn't decide when to eat, sleep, or speak. The sound decided for you. It was obedience disguised as holiness. Every few hours, the monks dropped whatever they were doing, cooking, studying, even dreaming, to kneel, chant, and start again. Time wasn't a river, it was a wheel, turning forever in place. And yet, in their quest for spiritual order, those monks accidentally invented something world-changing: the schedule. They didn't mean to. They weren't trying to make society more efficient. But the outside world was watching. The local townspeople heard the bells too. Farmers began using them to measure their workdays. Merchants set their market hours by them. Over time, the monastery's sacred routine leaked into the streets, infecting everyone with the same obsession for order. That infection became your daily life. When factories arrived centuries later, the industrialists didn't design a new system, they copied the monks. Bells became whistles, chapels became workshops, and prayers became productivity. The only thing missing was forgiveness. Instead of chanting psalms, workers clocked in. Instead of divine reward, they got wages. But the rhythm, the relentless march of hours remained. Even now, every time your phone buzzes, every meeting reminder or calendar ping, It's just a digital version of the same ancient summons. You're still answering bells, only now they wear Bluetooth. The monks called it ora et labora, pray and work. Modern society shortened that to just work. You're supposed to grind through the day, obedient to a clock you didn't choose, waiting for the moment you're allowed to rest, to eat, to feel something like peace. And just like those medieval brothers, you probably believe this is normal, even virtuous. Productivity is our new prayer, busyness, our confession. But back then, the irony was that the monks didn't work for survival. Their food, shelter, and clothes were already guaranteed by the abbey. They worked because it kept temptation away. Idleness, they believed, was the devil's playground, so they filled every minute with something copying manuscripts, brewing ale, tending gardens, mending robes, until exhaustion became holiness. The fewer unoccupied thoughts you had, the safer your soul. It sounds ridiculous, but isn't it familiar? When was the last time you sat still, truly still, without reaching for your phone or opening a tab? Somewhere deep in your brain, the same medieval anxiety still whispers, do something, stay busy, or the devil will find you. And then there were the meals. The monks didn't eat when they were hungry. They ate when the bell said it was time, often in silence, while a single brother read scripture aloud. Even their rest had purpose. Even their boredom was ritualized. The day wasn't theirs to enjoy. It was theirs to survive, hour by hour, prayer by prayer. Yet within that confinement, something remarkable happened. For the first time in human history, people began to measure life not by the sun, but by the clock. The monks turned time into something mechanical, predictable, a resource to be spent, and once time had value, people started selling it. That's how you ended up here, centuries later, trading your hours for rent, sitting in traffic at 8 a.m., pretending it's progress. And they even invented your lunch break. The sext hour, around noon, when monks paused to eat and pray. It was considered the most dangerous time. Spiritually, hunger made you weak, and weakness led to sin. So they built an entire ritual to keep temptation in check. You probably call it your lunch meeting. Different setting, same idea. When you think about it, you and those monks aren't so different. You both wake to alarms. You both count hours. You both obey invisible rules that promise peace if you just keep up. The difference is, their bells were real. Yours live inside your head. But not everyone in the Middle Ages followed this rhythm willingly. Outside the abbey walls, peasants worked by daylight, not doctrine, their hours bent to the sun, to the seasons. They laughed at the monks who prayed instead of sleeping. Yet, over time, the church's grip tightened. The peasants' days began to shrink, moulded into neat blocks that pleased both priest and lord. By the time the first factories appeared, the human spirit was already conditioned. The system didn't need to break anyone, it just needed to ring the bell. And so, when your alarm screams at 7 a.m. tomorrow, and you drag yourself from bed to the hum of fluorescent lights, remember this. You're not living in a modern miracle of efficiency. You're performing a medieval ritual designed to keep souls obedient. Only now, it's your calendar app that decides when you kneel. The monks believed that structure brought them closer to heaven. The modern world believes it brings us closer to success. Neither seems to have asked whether the bells ever stop ringing. But as the chant fades, and the candles in the chapel gutter low, one young monk, tired, half frozen, and quietly rebellious, glances toward the horizon. Beyond the monastery walls, he can see the faint lights of a nearby village. He imagines life without the bells, without the schedule, a day shaped by hunger and laughter, not by prayer. He doesn't know it yet, but that thought, tiny, forbidden, and glowing, will one day spread beyond these walls and change everything. Because when the world learns to measure time, it also learns how to rebel against it. And that rebellion is where our story goes next. The bells are still echoing in your head when you leave the monastery. You wander down into a village half hidden by morning mist, the kind of place where roosters crow before the sun, and every street smells faintly of smoke and damp straw. Life here moves slower than the monks' relentless hours, but not by much. The church spire looms over everything, a stone finger pointing at heaven, and, more importantly, reminding everyone who's in charge on earth. You pass a baker hauling trays of bread from his oven, a woman sweeping her doorstep, a farmer leading his sleepy mule. They all nod, politely, and then, suddenly, Someone sneezes. The sound explodes through the quiet like a gunshot. Instantly, every head turns. The woman drops her broom and crosses herself. The farmer mutters something that sounds suspiciously like a prayer, and the baker, without missing a beat, says, "God bless you." To you, it's a simple courtesy. To them, it's a line between life and death. Because in the Middle Ages, a sneeze wasn't just air and noise, it was a spiritual emergency. You see, back then, people didn't understand germs, bacteria, or viral transmission. What they understood was fear, and few things terrified them more than invisible forces that made the body betray itself. When someone sneezed, they believed something sacred was happening, or something demonic. Depending on who you asked, a sneeze could mean three things. Your soul was trying to escape, the devil was trying to get in, or the plague had just arrived at your doorstep. None of these were comforting. Options. It started in the 6th century, during one of the deadliest pandemics Europe had ever seen, the plague of Justinian. Cities emptied overnight, villages vanished, one cough could doom a family. People began to watch their neighbours closely, too closely. Every sniffle, every sneeze, every wheeze sounded like the drumbeat of death. So when Pope Gregory the Great, yes, that Gregory, the one who restructured the medieval church, saw panic spreading faster than the disease itself, he decided to act. Not with medicine, of course, but with prayer. He decreed that whenever someone sneezed, the faithful must immediately invoke divine protection. Deus te benedicat. God bless you. The logic was simple. If Satan was lurking near your nostrils, ready to snatch your soul as it fled your body, a quick blessing might keep him at bay. And people obeyed. Europe became a continent of compulsive blessers. One sneeze could summon a chorus of frantic prayers. Imagine it. The church bells, tolling, the smell of incense, and in every village square dozens of people shouting blessings at each other like medieval sirens. It must have sounded like chaos, but it wasn't just superstition, it was survival. Blessing someone after a sneeze became a public performance of compassion, proof that you weren't heartless enough to let your neighbour die unblessed. To stay silent was unthinkable. It meant you didn't care, or worse, that you were in league with the devil himself. There are records of villagers being shunned, or even accused of witchcraft for refusing to say God bless you. The irony, of course, is that sneezing probably did spread disease. All those droplets, all that close contact. But medieval logic had its own poetry. If you were doomed anyway, better to die blessed. Over the centuries, the plague faded, but the reflex didn't. The habit clung to people's tongues like dust on a crucifix. Even when the Renaissance brought science, even when scholars began dissecting cadavers and peering through crude microscopes, nobody thought to question the sneeze ritual. It had become too polite, too ingrained, too ordinary. Saying bless you wasn't about faith anymore, it was about decency. The church's ancient fear had been repackaged as etiquette, and that's how we got here. You're sitting in a meeting or on a bus, and someone sneezes. Instantly, you hear yourself mumble, "Bless you." You don't think. You just do it. You're reenacting a 1,000-year-old panic ritual designed to protect souls from demons. You're performing the same spell Pope Gregory ordered 1,400 years ago. You've never questioned it, because no one does. It's just manners. But it goes deeper than that. In the Middle Ages, words were more than sounds, they were power. The spoken blessing was thought to carry real, physical force. To say it wrong, or not at all, was dangerous. Priests taught that a blessing could seal your body against evil, the 5 your body against evil, way a shield deflects arrows. You couldn't see it, but it was there, shimmering around you like armour. So when the plague struck again in the 14th century, people doubled down. The Black Death turned Europe into one vast symphony of sneezes, screams, and blessings. Chroniclers wrote of entire towns echoing with the phrase Benedicite, until the words lost meaning, becoming part of the soundscape like the clanging of bells or the wailing of carts carrying bodies. The living blessed the dying blessed the living, and somewhere in the chaos, politeness was born. And that idea that words can protect, that rituals can keep danger away, still sits quietly inside modern manners. It's why we knock on wood, cross our fingers, or say good luck. We don't believe in the magic, but we do it anyway, because the gesture itself feels safe, familiar, human. It's strange, isn't it? How fear becomes habit, and habit becomes culture, and culture becomes you. If the monks gave us time, the sneeze gave us superstition. Both turned chaos into control. Bells told us when to move, and blessings told us what to say when the world fell apart. Together, they created a rhythm for surviving uncertainty, a rhythm we still dance to without knowing the tune. And yet, you can't help but wonder what else we're carrying from that age. What other medieval rules are hidden inside our most ordinary gestures? You already know your schedule is monastic, and your politeness is papal. But what about the things on your table? The tools you use every day? The very way you eat? Because centuries ago, there was something far more scandalous than sneezing. Something that shook the church, offended the nobles, and terrified priests. It wasn't sin. It wasn't heresy. It wasn't even witchcraft. It was a fork. A tiny piece of metal that changed the way people ate and nearly got them excommunicated for it. And that's where we're heading next. You leave behind the echo of blessings and bells, stepping into the warmth of a bustling medieval feast hall. The air is thick with wood smoke, laughter, and the heavy scent of roasted meat. Tables stretch the length of the room, groaning under the weight of bread, cheese, and steaming platters of stew. At first, it looks familiar, almost cozy, but then you notice something strange. No forks, hundreds of people eating, laughing, tearing, and slurping, and not a single fork in sight. They use knives, spoons, and fingers, scooping stew from shared bowls, tearing bread with their teeth, licking grease from their hands. It's chaotic, primal, and oddly joyful. A nobleman dips his entire hand into a dish of honeyed lamb, then wipes it on his sleeve. A lady of status carefully pinches a pastry between two fingers and offers it to her neighbour like a gesture of courtly love. Plates are rare, napkins non-existent. A few dogs wander between benches, cleaning spills straight off the floor. To a medieval diner, this is civilization. To you, it looks like the world's least sanitary buffet. And then, a ripple of shock moves through the crowd. Heads turn. A door creaks open. A woman enters foreign, elegant, draped in Byzantine silk. She's visiting from Constantinople, they whisper, and she's carrying something small and golden in her hand. A slender metal tool with two sharp prongs. She takes her seat, smiles faintly, and raises the object to her mouth. A fork, and just like that, the feast stops. For a long, awkward moment, no one moves. The priests at the head table exchange horrified glances. One drops his spoon, someone mutters a prayer. Because in this room, that delicate piece of cutlery isn't a utensil, it's an abomination. See, in the 11th century, the fork was new to Western Europe. It had existed for centuries in Byzantium and the Islamic world, places where table manners were refined to an art. Wealthy nobles used small golden forks to eat sticky or delicate foods without staining their hands. To them, it was cleanliness. To the Western Church, it was arrogance. The logic went like this. God, in his infinite wisdom, already provided humans with the perfect tools for eating 5 fingers, divinely attached. To replace them with metal was not only unnecessary, it was ungrateful. And worse, the fork's shape, those 2 gleaming prongs, looked suspiciously like something else, the devil's instrument. Clergymen preached fiery sermons against the utensil, calling it an insult to God's design. What arrogance, one Venetian bishop declared, to prefer gold to flesh. They accused fork users of vanity, decadence, and blasphemy. The church saw it as one more step down the slippery slope of sin, the idea that human invention could improve upon divine creation. And then came the story that sealed the fork's fate. A Byzantine princess, Theodora Anna Dukaina, married into the Venetian royal family. She arrived with her entourage, her golden, forks, and her refined habits. The Venetians were dazzled but wary. She refused to touch food with her fingers, using her forks even for fruit and bread. The priests were scandalized. God made hands, they thundered. Only the devil needs metal. When Theodora died young, likely of plague, the clergy wasted no time. Her death, they announced, was divine punishment for her pride and for daring to eat with a fork. The story spread like wildfire. In the decades that followed, the fork became a symbol of corruption. It was a mark of vanity, of Eastern decadence, of everything wrong with the wealthy. Even centuries later, Using one could earn you side eyes at dinner. The church didn't need to outlaw it formally, shame did the work. For hundreds of years, Europe stubbornly refused to evolve. Nobles and peasants alike continued to eat with their fingers, using knives only to cut large chunks of meat or bread. Food was communal, everyone dipped from the same bowl, chewed with the same hands, and occasionally traded infections without realizing it. There were rules, of course rules born of necessity. You wiped your hands before touching shared bread. You didn't dip if you were sick, at least not visibly sick. You didn't lick your knife in public. Small mercies of etiquette in a world still figuring out soap. The fork slowly crept back into fashion, not through religion, but through rebellion. By the Renaissance, Italian nobles began to reclaim it as a sign of sophistication. The poet Thomas Coriat, an English traveller in the 1600s, wrote with awe about Italian dining. The Italians do always use a little fork when they eat their meat. He returned home singing its praises and was promptly mocked for his foreign pretensions. People called him Furcifer, fork-bearer, as if he'd confessed to witchcraft. But fashion is contagious. When Catherine de' Medici married into the French royal family, she brought her own set of jewelled forks, and her influence changed everything. The French court, always eager to appear refined, began to imitate her. Eating with a fork transformed from heresy into high fashion. What was once sinful became sophisticated, and just like that, the Church's war on cutlery was lost. By the 17th century, the fork had conquered Europe. English gentlemen who once mocked it began polishing their own. Etiquette manuals sprang up, teaching people how to use it properly. Don't stab, don't shovel, don't gesture. Table manners became a social language, and the fork its most eloquent word. The irony? All those centuries of fear and outrage, all that divine condemnation, and in the end, it came down to hygiene. The same church that condemned the fork for being unnatural was also responsible for spreading disease by insisting that hands were holy enough for everything. Divine logic met human filth, and the filth won. Today, when you sit at a table and twirl spaghetti around a fork, you're performing a tiny act of rebellion that would have scandalized half of medieval Europe. Every polite meal, every delicate bite, every clang of metal against porcelain is a victory over centuries of superstition. You're holding in your hand what priests once called a sinful luxury, and yet, even that victory came with rules. As forks became normal, etiquette grew stricter. Don't lick it, don't point with it, don't cross it with your knife incorrectly. The tool that once symbolized freedom from primitive manners became a symbol of control again. Civilization, it seems, has a strange habit of turning rebellion into ritual. You glance around the feast hall one last time. The guests laugh again, the fear forgotten. The woman with the golden fork continues eating, defiant and serene. The priest glares, but he doesn't stop her. Somewhere deep down, he knows this small act is the future. And outside, the world continues to turn hungry for new customs, new sins, new excuses to pretend it has outgrown its fears. Because in this same world, not every medieval tradition dies. Some evolve, some hide. And some just put on a crown and call themselves civilization. Which brings us to another rule humanity carried out of the Dark Ages, the way we celebrate the end of freedom before marriage. A ritual so chaotic, so absurd, it could only have been invented by men with too much ale and too little sense. The medieval bachelor party, and it's just getting started. The smell hits you first, ale, sweat, and roasted meat, tangled together like a hymn to bad decisions. You're standing in a medieval tavern, where the floors are sticky with spilled beer, and the air is thick enough to chew. Somewhere in the corner, a minstrel plays a tune that sounds suspiciously like chaos set to rhythm. A group of knights are gathered around a long wooden table, mugs in hand, faces flushed, voices booming. This isn't a feast. This is a ritual, a farewell, party for freedom. The bachelor party, centuries before it came with matching t-shirts and neon sunglasses, was already alive and drunk in the Middle Ages. They called it a stag night, named after the animal that symbolized virility, wildness, and running headfirst into trouble. Tonight, the groom to be Sir Geoffrey of somewhere you've never heard of will be tamed tomorrow by holy matrimony. But tonight, he belongs to his brothers in arms, to ale, to noise, and to stories that no one will remember clearly in the morning. The tavern glows with firelight. A boar's head sits on the table, surrounded by trenchers of bread and slabs of meat. Someone toasts to the grooms last night as a free man. Someone else bets he won't survive a week of marriage. The laughter rolls like thunder. Even the innkeeper, an older woman with arms like siege engines, chuckles as she refills their mugs. But underneath the noise, you can feel something ancient, a pattern. This isn't just drunkenness, it's ceremony. Marriage, in the Middle Ages, wasn't about love, it was business. A deal struck between families, sealed with vows and reinforced by property. The bride brought a dowry, the groom brought a title, and together they created a polite alliance designed to keep wealth exactly where it already was. Romance, if it ever appeared, was purely accidental. So the stag night wasn't about love either. It was a coping mechanism, a final, desperate howl before the chains of matrimony clamped shut. For knights, who spent their lives fighting wars and chasing glory, marriage felt less like a reward and more like surrender. And so, on the eve of the ceremony, they did what medieval men did best, turned their anxiety into a party. There were no strippers, no dance floors, no limousines, but there were jugglers, minstrels, dice games, and gallons of ale. Men wagered their armour, their horses, even their boots. Some towns kept records of grooms who lost everything the night before their weddings and had to borrow clothes for the ceremony. They sang bawdy songs about maidens and monsters, told stories of past campaigns, and swore eternal loyalty to each other until the next morning, when most couldn't remember who they'd sworn it to. For a brief few hours, they pretended that they weren't about to become respectable, obedient husbands. They became wild again, laughing in the face of duty. The church, naturally, hated it. Priests called these gatherings feasts of sin. They preached that drunkenness before marriage invited demons into the soul and cursed the wedding bed. One bishop wrote furiously that a man who enters marriage from the alehouse enters damnation. The knights, of course, took this as a challenge. If the priests said damnation was waiting, they would at least arrive loudly. And so the stag night continued louder, rougher, and somehow holier in its defiance. The traditions varied by region. In England, men would carry the axis, groom through the village on a cart, pelting him with rotten fruit and shouting advice on how to survive married life. In France, the groom's friends staged mock kidnappings, dragging him from tavern to tavern until dawn. In Germany, they built bonfires and threw symbolic tokens of bachelorhood into the flames, daggers, dice, the occasional stolen chicken. It was part humiliation, part purification, and entirely ridiculous. But hidden in all the chaos was something sincere. Beneath the laughter and spilled ale, these men were saying goodbye not just to freedom, but to each other. Marriage pulled men away from their comrades, from their campaigns, from the life they understood. The tavern was the only place where they could be themselves one last time, surrounded by the noise and camaraderie of brotherhood. One chronicler from the 14th century describes a stag night gone wrong in grim detail. A groom, too drunk to stand, insisted on proving his love by jousting his best man in the courtyard. The horses collided. The groom broke his arm. The priest had to bless the wedding with the groom's arm in a sling. When asked what lesson he learned, the man reportedly replied, "Never marry sober." Of course, not every groom survived his own celebration. Alcohol poisoning was a very real medieval hazard. Tavern ale wasn't carefully brewed, it was unpredictable, potent, and often laced with ingredients meant to stretch profit rather than flavour. One too many mugs could send even a seasoned knight into a stupor that lasted days. Still, they kept drinking, as if intoxication itself were a prayer for courage. The funny thing is, the tradition didn't disappear, it just changed clothes. When the Renaissance arrived, the upper classes turned their stag nights into elegant dinners, full of poetry readings and polite jokes about domestic bliss. When the industrial age came, the working class reclaimed it, gathering in pubs after long shifts to celebrate a friend's impending doom, marriage. Today, when a groom stumbles out of a bar wearing a cheap plastic crown and a shirt that says, "Game over," he's walking in ancient footsteps. The same mixture of fear, humour, and rebellion still drives the ritual. He might not be a knight, but he's honouring 1,000 years of poor decisions and good stories. You can almost see it now, the flicker of torchlight replaced by neon, the sound of tankards replaced by bass, but the feeling unchanged. Humanity never stopped needing one last night of chaos before responsibility. And somewhere, Perhaps in a quiet corner of history, the monks who invented timekeeping are still shaking their heads. They tried to measure every hour, to discipline every soul, and here were the knights, turning those hours into a countdown to trouble. But the night is almost over. The tavern's fire burns low. The groom, half asleep on the table, is being serenaded by his equally drunk companions. The minstrel has switched to a softer tune now, something that sounds like regret. The laughter fades into murmurs, and as the dawn begins to creep through the cracks in the shutters, the first church bell rings. The men groan. The priests are already awake, preparing for the ceremony that will turn a man into a husband. Someone throws a mug across the room, someone else snores, and in the quiet aftermath, you realize the pattern again. Even rebellion ends on a schedule. But marriage doesn't just change the living. It also rewrote how the dead were honoured. The next time you see a funeral, all dressed in black, sombre faces in perfect rows, remember, that too came from here. From these same centuries of ritual, fashion, and fear. Because in the Middle Ages, grief was never quiet. It was a performance. And black was not the colour of sorrow, it was the colour of status. And that's where we're going next. The tavern fades behind you, its laughter dissolving into the cold morning mist. The bells, that once called monks to prayer, now toll for a different reason. You follow the sound into a narrow cobblestone street, where a slow procession winds its way toward the church. At first, you think it's another feast day, until you see the colour, black, everywhere. Men, women, even children draped in heavy black cloth that swallows the light, faces veiled, heads bowed. The air smells of candle wax, incense, and damp wool. A priest walks at the front, muttering Latin over the rhythmic thud of footsteps. Behind him, 6 men carry a coffin, carved with symbols of skulls and roses. A group of women follow, wailing so dramatically that it sounds rehearsed, and in a way, it is. You've stumbled into a medieval funeral, though not the kind you'd expect. This isn't just mourning, it's theatre. The idea that grief should look a certain way, that you should wear black, stand solemnly, and hide your joy started here in the late Middle Ages. Before this, death was messy, colourful, and loud. The ancient Romans wore white to funerals, believing the colour symbolised purity and the journey into light. Early Christians followed suit, favouring simple linen garments that represented rebirth. But as the centuries turned darker, literally and spiritually, Europe fell in love with sorrow as spectacle, and black became its costume. At first, it was practical. Black dye was rare and expensive. True, deep black required iron-based mordants and layers of costly pigment. Only the wealthy could afford it. So, when nobles began wearing black to funerals, it wasn't out of humility, it was a performance of privilege. It said, I can afford to grieve properly. The peasants wore whatever was clean, which was usually nothing resembling black at all. But over time, the rich set the standard, and mourning became fashion. By the 13th century, black wasn't just a colour, it was an identity. The church encouraged it, of course. Black symbolised humility before God, submission to divine will. And conveniently, it matched the clergy's own wardrobe. When priests preached about the virtue of sorrow, it didn't hurt that they already looked the part. Soon, death itself became an art form. Entire industries sprang up around grief. Tailors offered mourning packages for bereaved families, robes, veils, gloves, and ribbons. Painters sold memento mori portraits, portraits of the dead, surrounded by skulls, hourglasses, and fading flowers. Even perfume makers joined in, crafting scents of myrrh and cedar to mask the smell of decay. For the upper classes, funerals turned into parades of prestige. Coffins were lined with velvet, candles burned for days, and professional mourners were hired to wail on command. Some families staged funerals so elaborate they nearly bankrupted themselves, but to mourn cheaply was social suicide. If you didn't look devastated enough, people whispered that you hadn't loved enough. But grief wasn't just fashion, it was politics. Kings and queens used mourning as propaganda, turning their sorrow into symbols of power. When Edward I's beloved queen, Eleanor of Castile, died in 1290, he ordered 12 monumental crosses to be built across England to mark the journey of her funeral procession. It was both devotion and dominance, a love letter written in stone that said, "Look how deeply I can afford to suffer." By the time Queen Victoria came along in the 19th century, mourning black had become law unwritten but absolute. When her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she wore black for the rest of her life. 40 years of grief turned into an empire-wide trend. Shops advertised mourning attire for ladies of distinction. Society magazines published etiquette guides for the bereaved. Even jewellery joined the fashion. Mourning brooches filled with a lock of the deceased's hair became the height of sentimental chic. Of course, none of this existed for peasants. They didn't have the luxury of stylish sorrow. In the villages, death was still simple. You died at home, wrapped in linen, surrounded by family. The neighbours helped dig the grave, the priest mumbled a few words, and life went on. The idea of wearing black to prove your grief was as distant as owning a castle, but the symbolism trickled down. Over centuries, black slowly became universal. Even as dyes grew cheaper, the association remained powerful. To this day, we wear black not because it comforts us, but because it tells the world how to see us: controlled, sombre, appropriate. We inherited it from a world that believed emotions needed uniforms. And yet, not every culture followed that rule. In much of Asia, mourners still wear white, the colour of purity and release. In Africa, bright colours often dominate funerals, celebrating life instead of denying it. But in the West, we clung to darkness. We turned grief into elegance, sorrow into spectacle, death into an accessory. It's strange to think about, isn't? That something as simple as the colour of your clothes could be a 1,000-year-old echo of medieval theatre. Even now, when you attend a funeral, standing in your black coat beside a black car, you're performing the same ritual nobles once enacted under candlelight and incense. You're speaking the same silent language. I am civilized. I am mourning correctly. But in the Middle Ages, that language carried another layer of fear because the dead were never truly gone. The living believed souls lingered, hovering near their bodies, watching their own funerals. To dress improperly wasn't just social shame, it was spiritual danger. The dead could be offended. They might come back. So when you see those processions of veiled mourners and flickering candles, remember, it wasn't only grief that filled the air, it was superstition. Every tear shed, every garment worn, was a plea: stay where you are, don't haunt me. And yet, the more people tried to contain death with rituals, the more it spilled into life. Churches filled with relics, ossuaries overflowed, and entire towns grew up around cemeteries. The medieval obsession with mortality didn't make people less afraid. It made them fascinated. They painted skulls on walls, carved angels on tombs, whispered prayers into bones. Even now, the phrase, "rest in peace," isn't modern. It's ancient Latin requiescat in pace, a spell cast against restless spirits. Every funeral we hold, every candle we light, every black suit we wear, still carries the faint scent of that fear. The procession you've been watching finally reaches the church. The bells fall silent. The coffin disappears through the doors, swallowed by shadow. For a moment, everything stops. And then you notice something odd. A nobleman at the back of the crowd, shaking hands with the priest, exchanging polite smiles and murmured condolences. The handshake looks familiar, too familiar. And suddenly, it hits you: this simple gesture, this tiny moment of connection, has its own strange history. It wasn't born from kindness or faith. It was born from suspicion and fear. Because in the Middle Ages, shaking hands didn't mean hello. It meant, please don't stab me. And that's where we're going next. The church doors close behind the mourners, and for a while, the world is quiet again, just the sigh of wind through gravestones, the creak of wooden carts, and the faint murmur of people drifting away from grief back into life. You follow the nobleman who shook hands with the priest, watching him adjust his cloak as he steps into the sunlight. The handshake lingers in your mind, not the warmth of it, but the tension hidden underneath. It looked polite, maybe even sincere, but there was something else there too, a test, a warning, because in the Middle Ages, that gesture wasn't born from friendship. It came from fear. Long before anyone thought of handshakes as greetings, they were used as proof of peace, literally, a way to show that you weren't carrying a weapon. When two men met, especially strangers or rivals, the first thing they had to establish wasn't trust, it was survival. The open right hand was a declaration. See? I'm not here to kill you. It sounds dramatic, but in a world where everyone from knights to merchants travelled armed, suspicion was a way of life. A handshake was a truce in miniature. It said, "For now, we are safe." The right hand mattered because it was the weapon hand, the one that drew swords, knives, and daggers. Extending it was a small act of vulnerability. It forced both parties into a strange moment of equality. Neither could strike without warning the other. But it didn't stop there. Some medieval cultures added little flourishes to the ritual, gripping the forearm instead of the hand to ensure no hidden blade was tucked up a sleeve, or patting the other man's shoulder to feel for concealed daggers. These weren't gestures of affection, they were early versions of security checks. You weren't greeting someone, you were frisking them. The handshake's roots may stretch back even further. Ancient Greek carvings show warriors clasping hands as signs of respect before battle. Roman generals sealed agreements with similar grips, though always under the watchful eyes of witnesses, just in case respect turned into treachery. By the time medieval Europe inherited the habit, the handshake had become an instinctive ritual of survival. Of course, the church tried to clean it up, turning the handshake into something holier. When feudal lords swore oaths of loyalty to their kings or knights pledged service to their lords, the clasp of hands became a sacred seal. The ritual even had a name, immixtio manuum, the joining of hands. The vassal would kneel, place his hands between those of his lord, and swear obedience. It was solemn, symbolic, and deeply feudal, but the message never changed. The lower hand promised submission, the upper hand promised protection. Every handshake was an unspoken hierarchy disguised as harmony. You can almost see it now, a candlelit hall, two men facing each other, one armoured, one robed. They join hands, their eyes locked, each pretending the gesture means trust when both know it really means power. Somewhere in the background, a priest murmurs a blessing, as if words could make equality real. As centuries passed, the handshake slowly left the world of swords and oaths and crept into the world of manners. Merchants began using it in trade, sealing deals without paper. Pilgrims exchanged it on long journeys, promising not to rob one another. By the Renaissance, the handshake had begun to lose its edge of suspicion, at least among the educated classes. Still, the old fear never fully vanished. People shook hands with the same wariness you might use when petting a strange dog. There was etiquette to it. Don't squeeze too hard, it implies dominance. Don't let go too soon, it implies weakness. Don't look away, it implies deceit. A handshake wasn't about comfort, it was about control. And here's where things get interesting. Women didn't shake hands. Not then. The gesture was considered too bold, too masculine, too direct. A lady's greeting involved curtsies, nods, or the offering of a gloved hand for a kiss. The handshake belonged to the world of men, the world of bargains, blades, and suspicion. When a woman extended her hand in that way, it was often interpreted as scandalous, as if she were claiming equality in a language society refused to give her. The gesture travelled slowly through time, changing shape with every century. By the 18th century, it had become fashionable among gentlemen, an emblem of refinement rather than defence. And when revolutions rolled across Europe, it took on new meaning: equality, brotherhood. The handshake became the great leveller, the physical expression of democracy. When George Washington shook hands, instead of bowing or curtsying to his guests, people saw it as revolutionary proof that the new world had no kings, only citizens. It's strange to think that something as ordinary as a handshake carries so many ghosts. Every time two people meet and clasp hands, they're reenacting centuries of suspicion, submission, and transformation. The motion is simple, but the message is layered. I see you, I acknowledge you. I will not harm you. And yet, even in the modern world, those ancient instincts still whisper beneath the surface. You can tell so much from a handshake: the dominance of a squeeze, the hesitation of a pause, the chill of indifference. It's still a test. We just pretend it's politeness. During pandemics, we learn to stop, to wave, to nod, to bump elbows. For a while, the handshake almost died again, killed not by swords or social revolutions, but by germs. And it made people uneasy, as if removing the gesture removed the reassurance. We realized how deeply we rely on touch to signal safety. Without it, even the most polite words felt cold. But history has a funny way of coming back around. The handshake will return, because it always does. Fear might change its shape, but trust needs a body. You step closer to the nobleman you've been following. He's speaking to another man now, a merchant, judging by his clothes, and there it is again. The handshake. Quick, firm, practiced. A deal sealed, a promise made. For a moment, their suspicion flickers, replaced by something older than both of them, the relief of ritual. And then you notice the merchant's hands. They're stained faintly blue, the mark of a man who works with dyes. In this world, colour means everything. Red for nobility, green for fertility, blue for faith. But black, you've already seen what black means. What about the weathered yellows and browns of the peasants' tunics, or the shimmering silks of the nobles, or the plain white linen of the monks? What do they say about who people were allowed to be? Because in the Middle Ages, your clothing wasn't just fashion, it was law. You could be punished for wearing the wrong colour. And every stitch you wore told the world exactly where you stood. That's where we're heading next. The merchant's blue-stained hands fade from view as you follow him down a narrow, twisting lane. The smell of dye clings to the air, sharp, chemical, faintly metallic. He passes rows of drying cloth hung like flags above the street, strips of crimson wool, bolts of indigo, golden silk shimmering in the weak sunlight. It's beautiful at first glance, but there's something strange about it too. Each colour seems to belong to someone. Each fabric seems to whisper a rule. Because in the Middle Ages, clothing wasn't just about warmth or beauty, it was about control. You walk into the heart of the market square, and the evidence is everywhere. The peasants wear dull browns and greys, undyed wool, rough linen, practical and anonymous. Their tunics are simple, their cloaks patched and faded. In contrast, the nobles move like walking banners, scarlet cloaks, gold-threaded sleeves, jewel-encrusted belts. Even their shoes curl upward like question marks, mocking the ground they never have to touch. It isn't just fashion. It's a code, a set of laws so strict that wearing the wrong fabric could ruin your life. They were called sumptuary laws, and they governed everything from the colour of your hat to the material of your socks. At first, they were sold as moral rules, to keep people humble, to remind them not to indulge in vanity, but underneath, they were about hierarchy. Society depended on visible difference. A lord had to look like a lord, and a peasant had to look like dirt. If people started dressing alike, how could anyone tell who to bow to? In 1363, King Edward III of England issued one of the most infamous versions. It spelled out, in obsessive detail, who could wear what. Nobles could wear velvet, fur, and gold embroidery. Merchants could wear fine wool and silver accents, but only if their income exceeded a certain amount. Commoners, they were limited to plain cloth in muted tones. No silk, no bright dyes, no fur trims, no luxury. The penalties were severe. Wearing forbidden clothing could result in fines, confiscation, or even imprisonment. Tailors were punished for creating garments above station. A peasant who wore silk could be arrested for impersonating a gentleman. Even the colour purple, so expensive it required thousands of crushed sea snails to produce a single ounce of dye, was reserved exclusively for royalty. Purple wasn't just rare, it was sacred. To wear it without permission was an act of treason. You pass a woman selling indigo-dyed cloth. She glances around nervously, as though even displaying it might draw unwanted attention. Indigo was imported from distant lands, its blue hue so deep it seemed to swallow light. In the medieval imagination, blue belonged to the heavens worn by the Virgin Mary in paintings, symbolizing purity and divine favour. When the wealthy began copying that colour for their own wardrobes, the church stepped in to control who could wear it and when. Holiness had a dress code too, but colour was only part of the story. The cut of your clothing revealed just as much about your place in the world. Nobles wore long, trailing garments that dragged behind them like shadows, a visual reminder that they didn't need to walk quickly because the world waited for them. Peasants, meanwhile, wore short, practical tunics that kept out of the mud. Women's dresses were equally coded. The wider the sleeves, the higher the status. Some noble women's gowns were so extravagant they required servants to help them walk without tripping over their own sleeves. It wasn't just vanity, it was propaganda. The wealthy displayed their privilege through waste. The longer your sleeves, the more fabric you wasted, and the more obvious it became that you could afford excess. A peasant's clothes spoke of necessity, a noble's spoke of leisure. There's a strange kind of beauty in it, but also cruelty. In a world where plague and famine were constant threats, luxury was a language of dominance. The rich dressed like angels, the poor like soil, and everyone learned to read the message. Tailors became secret revolutionaries. Some risked punishment by smuggling forbidden patterns to the rising merchant class men and women who had money but no titles, desperate to dress like the nobility they envied. In some cities, entire underground economies emerged, where contraband, silk, and illegal dyes changed hands behind shuttered doors. Wearing the wrong colour became a quiet act of rebellion. It's hard not to see the irony. The monks who measured time, the priests who blessed sneezes, the nobles who condemned forks, all of them preached humility, yet wrapped themselves in gold and fur. The church denounced vanity while parading in robes of scarlet and silver thread. Every sermon about sin came from a pulpit draped in velvet. Even weddings became fashion battlegrounds. A bride's gown wasn't white. White didn't symbolize purity until centuries later. Medieval brides wore the richest colour they could afford, red, blue, or gold. The more extravagant the fabric, the higher her family's status appeared. Love had nothing to do with it. Marriage was a public transaction, and the dress was the receipt. As you move through the market, you notice something odd. A young man stands near the edge of the square, his cloak dyed a forbidden shade of crimson. It's beautiful, too beautiful. The fabric glows against the drab backdrop of the crowd like fire against ash. He catches you staring and quickly ducks into an alley. A moment later, a constable strides past, eyes sharp. You realize the boy's crime wasn't theft or violence. It was colour. You follow him, curious. Down the alley, he's already pulling the cloak inside out, hiding the red. Beneath it, he's just another grey figure in a grey world. Can't afford to stand out, he mutters, half to himself. Not unless you want trouble. He's right. In the medieval mind, visibility was dangerous. To dress above your station invited envy, punishment, or worse, accusations of sorcery. Some believed that only dark powers could make a commoner rich enough to afford silk. Fashion, in that sense, was a kind of witchcraft. And yet, even as these laws tried to freeze society into rigid layers, they couldn't stop ambition. The merchant class kept growing, buying colours and fabrics that once belonged only to nobility. The church kept tightening the rules, but the dye vats kept bubbling, the looms kept turning, and the world kept changing. By the time the Renaissance dawned, the boundaries between classes were blurring, and no law could bleach them back into order. But the obsession with appearances didn't die. It simply moved indoors. The clothes might have shown who you were on the outside, but what happened when your body betrayed you from within? What happened when the world stopped caring about what you wore and started caring about whether you lived long enough to wear it again? Because beneath all the silk and colour and ceremony, medieval life was still fragile. One bad cough, one bad meal, one unlucky flea, and it was over. And that's where we're going next. The illness, the fear, the strange cures, the medicine that killed more people than it saved. The world where healing was just another kind of faith. The colour drains from the market, the bright cloth, the chatter, the clink of coins all fade into a hush as you turn down another narrow street. The air changes. It's thicker here, heavy with something that isn't quite rot but isn't far from it. A faint, sour smell creeps in smoke, sweat, and sickness. Somewhere ahead, a bell rings again, not the crisp toll of a church, but a dull, uneven clang. You follow it until you reach a wooden door marked with a rough red cross. A voice calls from inside. Bring out your dead. Welcome to the other side of medieval life, the one that doesn't get painted in gold leaf or remembered in ballads. The side that everyone feared, everyone prayed against, and yet everyone met eventually. Illness wasn't just common in the Middle Ages, it was constant. It waited in every well, every rat, every breath. For most people, the question wasn't if you'd get sick, it was when. And when you did, the odds weren't good. You push open the door, the smell hits like a blow. Straw beds line the walls, filled with pale figures shivering under coarse blankets. A priest moves among them, clutching a wooden cross, whispering prayers. The physician beside him wears something far stranger, a long waxed robe, gloves, and a bird-like mask with glass eyes and a beak stuffed with herbs. The plague doctor, half healer, half omen. He doesn't speak as you pass. The air hisses through the mask's narrow holes. In his hand is a stick, which he uses to prod the sick from a distance. It's not cruelty, it's fear. To understand medieval medicine, You have to understand what people thought made them sick. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. To them, illness was spiritual or cosmic, a punishment or imbalance. The body was ruled by the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Good health meant those humours were in harmony. Get too angry, and your bile overheated. Feel too sad, and black bile poisoned the soul. Fall out of balance, and disease followed. Treatment, naturally, was about restoring balance by any means necessary. If you had a fever, they'd drain your blood. If you had swelling, they'd apply leeches. If you fainted, they'd burn herbs near your face to revive your humours. A medieval doctor's toolkit looked more like a blacksmith's box knives, hooks, cups for bleeding. The cure often hurt more than the disease, but pain meant progress. In the corner of the sick room, a woman moans softly. A nun kneels beside her, pressing a small iron cross to her lips. Healing was as much about faith as flesh. Priests blessed water, saints were invoked, relics touched to wounds. People wore amulets filled with prayers and powdered bone. Some hung herbs above their beds, believing scent alone could drive off sickness. The logic wasn't as mad as it sounds. Plagues did travel with bad air, miasma, they called it, and strong smells sometimes masked the stench of infection. The herbs stuffed into plague, masks lavender, mint, juniper, weren't cures, but they made breathing a little easier in the thick, foul air of dying cities. And then, in the mid-14th century, came the sickness that broke the world, the Black Death. It started, they said, with a whisper from the East ships arriving in Sicily, sailors coughing blood, rats crawling ashore. Within months, it reached every corner of Europe. Whole towns vanished. In some villages, there weren't enough living to bury the dead. The disease struck fast. A headache in the morning, a fever by noon, and by night, dark swellings the size of eggs under the skin buboes. The priests called it divine punishment. The doctors called it bad air. The people called it judgment. And yet, the world didn't stop. Priests held processions, whipping themselves bloody in public penance. Some people locked themselves indoors. Others fled, spreading the plague further. The wealthy sealed themselves in estates, burning incense and counting prayers. The poor dug trenches and hoped the wind would change. Everywhere, the same scene repeated. The bell, the red cross, the desperate silence. Bring out your dead. But even amid terror, there were glimmers of something modern. Some physicians began to notice patterns. They realized that crowded areas fared worse, that rats and fleas lingered near grain stores, that isolation worked better than prayer. Primitive, perhaps, but it was the beginning of logic, the seeds of science hidden in the soil of despair. Not everyone was convinced. One scholar in Paris declared that the plague was caused by a cosmic event, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars aligning to poison the air. His diagnosis was written in Latin and accepted as gospel. People burned herbs to cleanse the sky. For most, survival meant faith and superstition. Some wore charms inscribed with abracadabra, believing the word itself had healing power. Others swallowed crushed emeralds, gold dust, or powdered toads. Physicians prescribed strange diets. Avoid bathing, they said, or the disease will slip through your open pores. Eat onions, drink vinegar, sleep on rose petals, pray, always pray. It's easy to laugh now, but when you look closer, you see how human it was. In the face of death, people reached for whatever sense they could find. They tried to turn chaos into ritual. And in a strange way, they succeeded. The Black Death reshaped society. Labour shortages gave peasants leverage, breaking the rigid class system. Medicine became more experimental. Universities began teaching anatomy and dissection. The idea that illness could be studied, not just feared, took root. Out of darkness, a new world began to form. But fear lingers longer than reason. Long after the plague receded, people still carried its shadow in their habits. Blessing a sneeze, avoiding bad smells, distrusting strangers, it all stayed. The memory of sickness turned into superstition, and superstition turned into custom. You step back out into the street. The bell tolls again, softer now. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of bread from a nearby bakery, a reminder that life always returns, even after the worst of it. But there's something else in the air too. Incense, distant chanting, the faint promise of miracles. Because when medicine failed, faith was all that remained. And faith had its own strange cures, relics, pilgrimages, holy wells that promised healing, even if they delivered nothing but mud. You turn toward the sound of the chanting. In the distance, a crowd is gathering outside a chapel. They're kneeling before a bone encased in gold, whispering prayers through tears. A priest lifts the relic high, and the people reach out, desperate for a touch of salvation. You realize that in the Middle Ages, the line between medicine and miracle didn't exist. Healing wasn't found in science, it was borrowed from heaven. And that's where we're going next, to the altars and the relics, to the shrines that promised cures, to the faith that tried to fix what flesh could not. You follow the scent of incense through winding streets until you reach a small stone chapel perched on a hill. Its doorway is crowded with pilgrims, men and women of every age, wrapped in travel-stained cloaks, faces lined with exhaustion and hope. Some have come on foot from villages miles away. Others crawl on their knees for the last few yards, whispering prayers through cracked lips. Every one of them is here for the same reason: healing. A wooden sign near the door reads, Sanctus Laurentius, cures for the afflicted. Inside, candles flicker like stars in a cave. The air is thick, almost alive with the scent of wax, sweat and faith. At the altar, behind a silver grate, rests the treasure they've all come to see. A fragment of bone, yellowed and ancient, encased in glass and gold. A relic. In the medieval world, a relic was medicine, proof of divinity in physical form. Saints didn't just intercede with God, their bodies were conduits of power. A splinter of bone, a drop of dried blood, a scrap of robe, all were believed to hold miracles. A man could limp into a chapel and walk out whole. A woman could pray over her child's fever and watch it vanish. At least, that's what people believed. And belief, in a world ruled by uncertainty, was everything. You step closer to the relic. The priest standing beside it chants softly in Latin, waving a censer that spills fragrant smoke over the kneeling crowd. One by one, they approach the relic, pressing cloths and rosaries against the glass, hoping to capture a spark of its holiness. The faithful believe that touching something holy can transfer power, like a charge of divine electricity. It's easy to scoff now, but to them, it made sense. Medicine was dangerous, expensive, and often lethal. Doctors bled you, purged you, or covered you in poultices made of strange ingredients, ground pearls, snail slime, even powdered mummy imported from Egypt. If you survived the treatment, it was considered a success. For the poor, who could never afford a physician, the church was the only hospital they had. And in some ways, it worked. Monasteries became centres of healing, long before medicine had any science behind it. Monks grew herbs in gardens, sage for fevers, mint for stomach pain, poppy for sleep. They brewed salves and tinctures, recorded recipes in careful Latin, and prayed over every dose. Some herbs genuinely helped, others were harmless. But all was sanctified with ritual. Then came the relics. Every church wanted one. The bones of saints were worth more than gold. Entire pilgrimages sprang up around them, as towns competed to claim fragments of the holy. There were enough true pieces of the Holy Cross in circulation to build a small forest. There were at least 6 skulls of St. John the Baptist, depending on which church you asked. Faith didn't require proof, it required a story. And for many, those stories saved lives, or at least spirits. Take the case of St. Roch, the patron of plague victims. He was said to have survived the Black Death by retreating into the woods with nothing but his faith and a loyal dog. When he emerged cured, his bones were declared miraculous. Pilgrims flocked to his relics, believing they could ward off infection. Even towns without his remains built chapels in his name, convinced his protection extended across distance. Then there was Saint Apollonia, whose teeth were torn out during martyrdom. People suffering from toothaches prayed to her image, or, if they were lucky, a tooth fragment said to be hers. When pain subsided, even by coincidence, it was called divine mercy. In this world, faith filled the gaps science couldn't. Disease wasn't random, it was a test. Healing wasn't physical, it was spiritual. If your prayer went unanswered, it wasn't because the saint failed you. It was because you hadn't believed hard enough. But sometimes, faith turned darker. Desperation made people cruel. In plague years, Pilgrims lined the roads like moving processions of agony, whipping themselves bloody to earn forgiveness. They sang hymns through clenched teeth, convinced their pain could cleanse the world's sin. The church alternated between condemning them and blessing them, depending on whether the crowds were obedient or not. Inside the chapel, you watch as a mother presses her child's hand to the relic's glass. The boy is thin, feverish, eyes half closed. The priest murmurs a blessing, but his face gives away nothing. He's seen this too many times to hope easily. When the prayer ends, the mother lifts her son and whispers, "You'll get better now." You can't tell whether she's speaking to him or herself. For some, the pilgrimage alone was the cure. Walking hundreds of miles, fasting, praying, it changed people. The pain became its own medicine. The body broke so the soul could feel mended. And sometimes, that belief, the sheer conviction that you would heal, was enough to make the body follow. There's a strange beauty in that kind of faith. It's fragile and fierce all at once. It gave people courage when there was nothing else. Even now, hospitals still use words borrowed from religion. Patients who trust their care. We still light candles, still whisper to the air when science can't give us certainty. But faith could also be manipulated. Churches charged fees for access to relics. Towns faked miracles to attract pilgrims and their coins. When an epidemic struck, the desperate paid fortunes for holy water that was little more than well water. The poor sold everything for a chance to touch bone dust. Faith and commerce became intertwined, each feeding the other's hunger. Outside, the sun dips low, the crowd begins to thin. The priest extinguishes one candle, then another, until the chapel is left in flickering half-darkness. The relic gleams faintly in its case, a bone no different from any other except for what people believe about it. You step back into the evening air, your clothes heavy with incense. Around you, the pilgrims scatter down the road, clutching their relic cloths and whispered hopes. You can feel the weight of their faith, the comfort and the cost of it. In a world that had no answers, belief became the only medicine that worked. But not everyone trusted miracles. Some believed illness came from human sin, not divine punishment. Others thought it spread through bad air or bad behavior. And when faith wasn't enough, fear filled the gap. Fear of strangers, fear of sinners, fear of witches. Because when the prayers didn't work, someone had to be blamed. And that's where we're heading next. The trials, the punishments, the terrible, absurd ways people tried to force the world back into order. The road from the chapel is long and silent. Pilgrims fade into the distance, their prayers swallowed by the wind. You follow the curve of the path until the smell of incense dies away, and something sharper takes its place, smoke, acrid and bitter, a different kind of ritual. A crowd gathers ahead, their faces lit by a shifting orange glow. You've walked from faith into judgment. In the square, a wooden platform rises above the crowd. On it stands a man bound at the wrists, his face bruised, his hair singed at the edges. Behind him, the stake, the firewood piled high. The priest at his side recites a prayer loud enough to drown the man's trembling breath. Around them, people whisper, cross themselves, weep, or jeer. You've arrived at one of the Middle Ages' most powerful institutions, punishment. To modern eyes, it looks like madness, public executions, trials by ordeal, torture chambers beneath cathedrals. But to the medieval mind, punishment wasn't about cruelty, it was about purity. A world ruled by faith needed balance, and sin disrupted that order. To restore harmony, the guilty had to suffer. The pain wasn't punishment, it was purification. And everyone watched, because justice was a public affair. It began with spectacle. The executioner was part performer, part priest. He didn't just kill, he demonstrated morality. Every act of violence was wrapped in ceremony, the ringing of bells, reading of prayers, the signing of the cross. The fire didn't just destroy the body, it cleansed it. In theory, the crimes that led here were as strange as they were terrifying. Heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, adultery, theft, each carried its own choreography of shame. For blasphemy, tongues were pierced. For theft, hands were cut off. For heresy, there was fire. Every punishment had symbolism, because justice wasn't meant to reform the sinner, it was meant to warm the soul. And everyone, from kings to beggars, was afraid of being next. In smaller towns, punishments were more inventive. Stocks in the village square. The pillory, where offenders were locked by the neck and wrists while passers-by hurled rotten food and insults. The cucking stool, used mostly on women accused of gossiping or unruly behaviour, was a chair lowered into a river again and again until the accused was either silent or unconscious. It sounds barbaric, and it was. But these acts weren't just punishment, they were theatre. The community gathered to witness evil being physically expelled from their midst. Pain became reassurance that the world still made sense. And then came the superstition. The idea that misfortune always had a culprit. If crops failed, it wasn't drought, it was witchcraft. If a child fell ill, someone had cursed them. If lightning struck a barn, the devil had aimed it. When the natural world defied explanation, people filled the gaps with fear. The word witch didn't always mean what it does now. In early medieval Europe, it referred mostly to herbalists, midwives, and healers, women who knew too much about the body for comfort. They used herbs and charms to ease pain, deliver babies, and predict the weather. Useful, yes, but power outside the church was always dangerous. So when plagues and famines struck, suspicion turned toward them. A woman who healed the sick might one day be blamed for causing sickness. A midwife whose child died in childbirth could be accused of consorting with demons. Trials spread like wildfire through the 14th and 15th centuries, fanned by panic and politics. There were laws, of course, but they bent easily under fear. Trials by ordeal replaced evidence. If you were accused of witchcraft, you might be thrown into water with your hands tied. If you floated, you were guilty, the pure water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, though you'd likely drown before proving it. Another test involved red-hot iron. The accused would carry it a set distance, then wait 3 days. If their hand healed cleanly, God had declared them pure. If it blistered or festered, they were damned. Few passed unscarred. And yet, belief in such ordeals was sincere. People truly thought God intervened. The outcome wasn't random, it was divine judgment, visible for all to see. In a world where courts were corrupt and evidence scarce, miracles were the only measure of truth. The cruelty had its own twisted logic. Fear held society together. The threat of divine punishment kept people obedient to laws written as much by priests as by kings. The church preached mercy, but mercy without fear meant rebellion. In a sense, the entire system was built on the same foundation as medicine and faith, the idea that suffering could save you. Whether your soul, your body, or your society, it was all one belief. Pain purged corruption, fire purified flesh, and the people believed it, because what choice did they have? You watch as the priest finishes his prayer. The executioner steps forward, torch in hand. The crowd leans in, breathless, both horrified and hungry for the sight. When the fire catches, it roars like an animal. The man's cry rises and is swallowed by the sound of the flames. The crowd crosses themselves again, murmuring Deus vult, God wills it. But not everyone in the crowd believes. Near the edge of the square, a woman watches without expression. Her face is calm, her hands still. She doesn't flinch when the fire flares. She doesn't whisper the prayers. Her eyes, sharp and unreadable, meet yours for a moment, and in that look, you sense something dangerous. Defiance. Because even in the age of fear, not everyone bowed to it. There were those who questioned the rituals, who doubted the miracles, who whispered that maybe God wasn't in every plague or punishment. Some of them were burned as heretics. Some simply vanished into the hills, but some survived, passing their skepticism in secret through generations. The woman turns away, melting into the alley. Her cloak disappears into shadow. You hesitate, then follow. The crowd's noise fades behind you, replaced by the low hum of the night, the rustle of wind, the crackle of distant fires, the endless rhythm of survival. The air grows cooler, calmer. Somewhere ahead, the sound of running water. Because for all the church's control, there was one thing it couldn't fully own: the river, the people's lifeline, their source of food, drink, and baptism alike. And in those waters lay another story, one of superstition, yes, but also of necessity. Because in a world ruled by fear and fire, water was the only true salvation. You follow the sound of water until the burning light of the square fades behind you. The air cools, thick with river mist. The smell of smoke and sweat gives way to something cleaner: mud, moss, damp stone. The faint gurgle of a stream cuts through the silence, and soon you see it, a river winding lazily through the heart of the town, silver in the moonlight. At first glance, it looks peaceful, almost holy, the same water that baptizes, that cleanses, that flows beside cathedrals. But as you get closer, the illusion breaks. The surface is murky, rippled with filth. A butcher rinses his knives in it. A washerwoman beats clothes on the bank, next to a man emptying a bucket of something foul. 2 pigs root along the edge, drinking without hesitation. This, right here, was the heartbeat of medieval life. Not the grand cathedrals, not the castles or courts, but the rivers and wells. Everything drinking, cooking, cleaning, trade depended on water. And water, in turn, depended on luck, because in the Middle Ages, clean water was as rare as peace. Most rivers doubled as sewers. Waste from homes, tanneries, and butchers poured into them day and night. Cities grew faster than their systems could handle, and the result was chaos in liquid form. Wells, dug too close to cesspits, filled with contamination. Sweet water, people called it when it was clear, but clarity meant nothing. You could drink from a sparkling stream and be dead within days. The people didn't know about bacteria, of course. They saw disease as divine punishment, not a matter of hygiene. So when sickness followed dirty water, they didn't blame the river. They blamed sin. But survival makes people practical, even when science doesn't exist. Somewhere along the way, they discovered something that changed everything. Boiled or fermented liquids didn't make you sick. So while water became dangerous, beer became salvation. It wasn't the kind of beer you know today, no golden foam or frosty mugs. Medieval beer was thick, cloudy, more like liquid bread than drink. Brewed from barley, oats, or rye, it was low in alcohol but rich in calories. For peasants who worked long days in the fields, it was both food and drink. Children drank it, monks drank it. Even pregnant women drank it, not because they wanted to, but because it was safer than water. It's said that in some towns, the average medieval person drank between 1 and 2 gallons of ale a day. Not for celebration, just to stay alive. You walk along the riverbank and spot a small brew house, smoke rising gently from its roof. Inside, the air is warm, thick with the smell of malt and yeast. A woman stirs a bubbling pot with a wooden paddle, her face glistening with steam. These, women brewsters, as they were called, were the quiet lifelines of their communities. Brewing was one of the few trades open to women, and in many towns, every household brewed its own ale. Recipes were guarded like secrets, passed from mother to daughter. The process was simple but magical. Grain was soaked, dried, and ground into malt, then boiled with water to make a thick mash. Hops were rare in early brewing, most used herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow for flavour. Once cooled, the liquid was fermented with wild yeast, turning sugar into alcohol. The result, a drink that could be stored for days without spoiling, a drink that killed the invisible killers in the water. Monasteries perfected the art. The monks who once measured time by bells soon became masters of beer. Brewing fit perfectly into monastic life. It was labour, it was sustenance, and it was safe. They even classified different strengths of ale. Strong ale for guests, weaker ale for the brothers, and the lightest, small beer for daily drinking. When travellers passed through, monks offered a mug before food or lodging. Drink and give thanks, they'd say, and for once, it wasn't superstition. It was survival advice. Wine played its part too, especially in warmer regions, but unlike beer, wine belonged to the wealthy. Grapes didn't grow easily in the cold north, so wine became a luxury imported from warmer lands. The peasants brewed ale, the nobles toasted with red. Even drink became a class divide. And yet, the divide blurred in moments of crisis. During plague years, when the rivers turned deadly and wells ran dry, everyone rich and poor alike turned to ale. Taverns overflowed. Brewing became a holy act, a civic duty. And in those dimly lit rooms, with the smell of yeast and smoke in the air, people found something they hadn't felt in a long time: comfort. The tavern was more than a place to drink. It was the medieval social network. Deals were struck there. Marriages, arranged, songs sung, and news shared. A man could walk in alone and leave with friends or enemies. You step into one now. The room is dim, lit by candles, and the glow of a hearth. Wooden mugs thud against tables, Laughter mingles with argument, and the air hums with warmth. The ale is warm, slightly sour, but it tastes alive. You can see why people clung to it. It numbed the cold, softened the fear, blurred the hard edges of survival. In a world where water could kill you, this was liquid safety, liquid hope. But not everyone saw it that way. The church tolerated beer monks, brewed it, after all but warned against excess. Drunkenness was a sin, and taverns were dens of temptation. Priests preached sermons about the dangers of ale, even as they quietly sipped it in their cloisters. Still, people came, night after night, to drink, to talk, to forget. For peasants whose days were measured by toil and bells, ale was the only escape. It made laughter possible. It made life bearable. And yet, under the warmth of the fire, beneath the clink of mugs and the hum of music, you can feel it, the same undercurrent that runs through every medieval custom. Fear. The knowledge that the world outside was still fragile. That one bad harvest, one strange wind, one sickness could end it all. A man at the next table mutters about the weather. "Too cold this spring," he says. "The crops'll fail again." Another nods grimly. "Aye, God's angry." You glance toward the window. Outside, the wind howls, carrying the smell of rain and something darker, storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Because in the Middle Ages, weather wasn't just weather, it was prophecy. It was punishment. It was the one thing no prayer, no relic, no ale could tame. And when the skies turned against you, there was nothing left to do but watch everything you'd built wash away. And that's where we're heading next, to the storms, the famine, the years when the heavens themselves turned. Cruel. The tavern's warmth fades behind you. Outside, the air is heavy, uneasy, as though the night itself is holding its breath. The smell of rain is sharp and metallic, and in the distance, thunder mutters low across the hills. A storm is coming, not the kind you can hide from under a roof, but the kind that changes everything. You follow the road out of town, past the last flickering lanterns, until the fields stretch before you wide, silent, and dark. In daylight, they'd be golden with grain or green with hope. But tonight, under bruised clouds, they're nothing but mud and memory. This is where the true power of the Middle Ages lived and died. Not in thrones or cathedrals, but in the soil. The earth fed everyone, and when it stopped, the world stopped too. The first sign was the rain. It came early and didn't stop. Spring after spring, the skies opened, drowning the crops. Fields turned to swamps, grain rotted where it stood, and livestock sank into mud. Rivers swelled, washing away bridges, homes, and hope. It wasn't just bad weather, it was a curse that lasted years. Historians would later call it the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317. But for the people who lived through it, names didn't matter. What mattered was that the world itself seemed to turn against them. You walk along the edge of a ruined field. In the dark, you can still see the stunted stalks, black with rot. Somewhere nearby, a farmer kneels, digging through the muck with his bare hands. He's searching for anything that might still be edible, a turnip, a beet, a scrap of life. His face is gaunt, his eyes hollow. Behind him, his children huddle beneath a broken cart, silent and small. The famine didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like a rumour. First the price of bread doubled, then tripled. People began selling everything: tools, livestock, even clothes for a few handfuls of grain. When that ran out, they ate grass, bark, even clay. In some chronicles, there are whispers of darker things, parents abandoning children, neighbours disappearing, graves disturbed. Whether all of it was true doesn't matter. What mattered was that everyone believed it could be. The famine was more than hunger. It was humiliation. Medieval life revolved around the harvest, planting, tending, reaping, storing. Every ritual, every saint's day, every superstition existed to keep that rhythm safe. So when the rhythm broke, it wasn't just the stomach that starved, it was the soul. People believed God had turned away. The church tried to restore order with processions, prayers, and fasting, though fasting was no great sacrifice when there was nothing to eat. Priests led barefoot marches through towns, carrying crosses, begging the heavens for mercy. Bells tolled not for the dead, but for rain to stop or for it to come. In one village, they say, the people carried the bones of their patron saint into the fields and left them there overnight, hoping to shock the sky into pity. It didn't work. The rain kept falling, and when it finally stopped, the sun returned with vengeance. Drought followed flood, baking the earth into dust. Crops that had survived the rot shriveled in their stalks. The rivers that once drowned villages now shrank into trickles. The cycle of survival was broken. Across Europe, the famine killed millions not with swords, but with silence. No grand battles, no enemies to blame. Just cold, wet wind, and the slow betrayal of nature. In the towns, bakers locked their doors. Riots broke out over crumbs. The church preached endurance, but endurance doesn't fill a child's belly. The peasants looked upward and saw no heaven, only clouds. But famine, like fire, burns away illusions. It revealed who people really were. Some turned desperate, some turned kind, some turned cruel. In England, the king banned hoarding, declaring that anyone caught stockpiling grain would be executed. In France, nobles fled their estates to eat, from church stores. In Germany, millers were lynched for grinding grain. Two fine people accused them of stealing the dust that could have become bread. And yet, in the middle of the chaos, there were moments of quiet resilience. Families sharing the last crust of bread, monks opening their doors to feed strangers, neighbours gathering under makeshift shelters, telling stories by candlelight, not to forget their hunger, but to remember they were still human. You find one such gathering now, a small cottage, barely standing, its roof patched with straw. Inside, a few villagers huddle around a single loaf, slicing it into paper-thin pieces. The oldest woman says a prayer before the knife touches the bread. Not for abundance, just for survival. This, she whispers, is how the Lord tests us. Her voice trembles, but her hands don't. She cuts each piece as if it were sacred. It's easy to romanticize resilience from a distance, but here, in this moment, it's just another. The form of exhaustion. The world is tired. The people are tired. The rain doesn't care. And yet, the storm always ends. By the 1,320 seconds, the skies finally cleared. The rivers calmed. The soil breathed again. Fields greened. Life returned, but not as it was. The famine had left scars deeper than graves. Entire villages had vanished. Land went untended. Labourers became precious. For the first time, peasants could demand wages. The feudal order began to crack. The famine didn't just starve people, it fed change. When you think about it, that's the strange rhythm of history. Disaster followed by transformation. Every collapse makes space for something new to grow. But even as crops returned, fear never left. The people of the Middle Ages lived with one truth written in every prayer. Survival was temporary. They never knew which part of creation would turn on them next. The sky, the soil, the sea. You step back outside. The rain has started again, soft at first, then heavier. The air hums with thunder. For a moment, you imagine what it must have been like to live this way, to hear rain not as music, but as a threat. Lightning flashes across the fields, and for a heartbeat, the land glows silver, wet and endless. And in that brief light, you see something moving far down the road. Figures on foot, wrapped in cloaks, trudging through the storm. Travellers, pilgrims, maybe even refugees from another hungry town. Because when famine came, people didn't stay still. They walked, they wandered, they searched for safety, for food, for hope, for miracles. And that is where the story goes next. To the road, to the danger and wonder of travel in a world that had barely learned to move, to the way distance itself was a test of faith. The road stretches out before you, slick with rain, winding into the grey distance like a scar across the land. You can hear the soft squelch of boots on mud, the rattle of wooden cart wheels, the low murmur of voices half lost to wind. You've joined a line of travellers, strangers bound together, not by friendship but by necessity. In the Middle Ages, the road was both promise and punishment. You pull your cloak tighter. Every step away from home is a gamble. The world beyond your village is vast, unpredictable, and mostly unkind. There are no maps for common folk, no clear borders between kingdoms, no guarantee you'll arrive where you're going or that you'll be welcomed when you do. Yet people travelled anyway. Some were pilgrims, walking hundreds of miles to holy sites, chasing miracles or redemption. Others were traders, hauling goods between towns. A few were desperate peasants fleeing famine or war. And a rare few minstrels, monks, wanderers, walked simply because they couldn't stay still. The road itself was an ecosystem, ruts filled with water, hedgerows whispering with insects, stones slick with moss. It smelled of earth and sweat and fear. Travellers slept where they could under trees, in barns, sometimes on bare ground beside their dying fires. The lucky ones found inns, but luck was expensive. You pass one now, a crooked timber building with a faded sign swinging in the rain. Inside, the warmth hits you like a wave. The air hums with laughter, dogs bark, and a serving girl darts between tables carrying mugs of ale. This is the heart of the medieval road, the inn. To the weary, it was salvation. To the suspicious, it was a den of thieves. Inns were equal parts refuge and risk. You could find a meal, a bed, a story, but also fleas, pickpockets, and the occasional knife fight. Beds were shared, often with strangers. Privacy didn't exist. The host took your coin, your name if you had one, and sometimes your belongings if you weren't careful. But the road had its own code. Travellers looked out for one another mostly. There were unwritten rules: share your fire, keep your knife visible, don't ask too many questions. Everyone was equal in the mud. Across the table, a group of men huddle around a candle, trading rumours in hushed tones. You catch fragments: a new plague in the south, bandits near the bridge, a miracle spring in the next valley. News travels by mouth here: war, weather, prophecy, all carried by people who walk. The medieval world didn't have headlines, it had storytellers, and every traveller was both messenger and mythmaker. You learn quickly that the road belongs to the desperate and the devout. The pilgrims are easy to spot. They wear badges on their cloaks, shells, crosses, or tiny pewter tokens that prove where they're headed. The most famous paths lead to Canterbury, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela. Those who can't afford the journey carve small crosses into their doorframes instead, making a pilgrimage of the heart. But those who walk the true pilgrims live between worlds. They sleep in strangers' barns, beg for food, and follow stars instead of maps. Every step is a prayer. Some go to thank God, others to bribe him, a few to test whether he's still listening. They carry little more than a staff, a water flask, and faith. Not all pilgrims are saints. Some are criminals, walking to escape punishment. Others fake piety to beg more effectively. The roads are full of masks, holy and otherwise. In truth, travel in the Middle Ages was one long act of performance. You had to play the role the world expected if you wanted to survive it. Beyond the inn, the road darkens. The trees crowd close, the air thick with damp bark and the faint scent of wood smoke. You hear wolves in the distance. The travellers bunch together, eyes wide, torches raised. Roads weren't safe after dusk. Bandits waited where light couldn't reach. Medieval bandits weren't the romantic outlaws of legend. They were survivors, former soldiers, failed farmers, exiles, the forgotten debris of endless wars. They hid in forests, robbing merchants, ransoming nobles, or disappearing entire caravans into the woods. Sometimes they killed. Sometimes they simply took what they needed and vanished. And if you were caught by the wrong kind of men, not thieves, but guards, you could fare worse. Many towns demanded tolls from travellers, and if you couldn't pay, your goods or your body became collateral. Freedom of movement was a myth. Every road belonged to someone richer than you. But still, people walked. The road had magic in it. Not the kind of magic from books or spells, but the kind that happens when motion itself becomes meaning. For pilgrims, every ache was a hymn. For traders, every mile meant another chance at survival. For those fleeing famine, each horizon promised something better than yesterday. You pass through one village at dawn. The rain has stopped, leaving the world washed clean and grey. Children chase chickens across the muddy street. A blacksmith hammers iron beside a church whose bell hasn't rung in months. You notice that even here, at the edge of everything, there's life. People endure. They always do. Travel in the Middle Ages wasn't about adventure. It was about endurance. Journeys took weeks, months, sometimes years. You walked until your shoes fell apart, then tied rags around your feet and kept going. You slept on dirt, ate what you could find, and prayed that the next town had bread. And if you survived, if you reached your destination, you arrived transformed. The road reshaped people. Every step was a negotiation between faith and fear. And sometimes, amid all the hardship, beauty appeared. A sunrise over the hills, a stranger sharing bread. A quiet moment at a roadside shrine where someone had left a carved wooden cross wrapped in ribbons. Even the poorest traveller could leave something behind, proof that they had passed through, that they had mattered, if only for a moment. By now, your group has thinned. Some have stopped at villages. Others have taken different forks in the path. The road narrows until it's little more than a trail. Ahead, the land opens into meadows lit by the last light of day. The air smells of wood smoke and roasted grain. Somewhere nearby, bells ring not for warning, but for evening prayer. You follow the sound until you see it, a small cottage, its windows glowing gold, its chimney curling smoke into the twilight. Inside, a family sits by the hearth, eating in silence. A loaf of bread, a pot of stew, a single candle. The door creaks open, and the father looks up, eyes tired but kind. "The road's long," he says softly. "Come in." You step inside. The warmth is quiet and unpretentious, the kind that seeps into your bones. For a moment, the world outside doesn't exist, no famine, no plague, no fear. Just the soft crackle of the fire and the smell of stew. The family eats slowly, reverently. The firelight paints their faces in amber and shadow. This is how most medieval days ended, not in grandeur or terror, but in small mercies. The mother refills your cup and smiles faintly. "Tomorrow," she says, "the fair opens in the next town. You'll hear the bells from here." You nod. Outside, the wind shifts, carrying a distant sound, a hum of voices, the faint clang of market stalls being built, laughter carried on the air. Because after every journey, after every storm, after every trial, life continues. The market opens, the bread is baked, the bells ring again, and that's where we'll go next. To the market. To the noise and colour of medieval life, at its most alive. To the final hours of the day, when the world settles into night. Morning returns, soft and silver. The cottage is quiet when you wake, the family already gone to their fields. Outside, mist clings low to the earth, curling between trees and thatched roofs. The road ahead hums faintly with distant sound voices, laughter, the ringing of bells carried on the breeze. You follow it through the haze until the world opens up again, and there it is. The market. You can smell it before you see it. Spices, animals, smoke, and bread. Then the noise hits. The sleepy countryside explodes into motion. Dozens of stalls line the square, patched together from rough wood and bright fabric. Merchants shout prices over the din of bleating goats and squawking chickens. Women haggle over onions. Children dart between legs, chasing coins and crumbs. This is the heart of the medieval town. Messy, loud, alive. The same people who whispered prayers in chapels and bowed before relics now jostle and argue over the price of eggs. Faith ruled their souls, but the market ruled their days. You move through the crowd slowly, letting it swallow you. Every sense is filled at once. The fishmonger's stall smells of salt and the sea. Next to him, a blacksmith sells iron nails and horseshoes still warm from his forge. The baker's table overflows with loaves dusted in flour, the crusts cracking like sun-baked earth. Someone hands you a small piece to taste coarse and dense, but fresh. You realize it's the first time in this whole journey that you've tasted something that isn't born of necessity, but of care. For the peasants, market day is everything. It's not just a place to buy food, it's a pulse of freedom. For one day each week, the rhythms of bells and fields pause. The walls between classes blur just a little. Even the poorest farmer can stand beside a noble and shout his price. Money makes everyone equal, at least for an hour. You pass a group of travelling merchants gathered around a cart piled high with goods from distant lands. Spices from the east, saffron, pepper, cinnamon, silk dyed in impossible colours. Glass beads that catch the sun and throw it back like shards of rainbow. The merchant tells anyone who'll listen that his wares came from Venice, though it's more likely they came from the next county. Still, the fantasy sells. People buy not just objects but glimpses of the wider world, proof that somewhere beyond these muddy streets, magic exists. Beside him, a juggler performs for coins, his bright costume clashing with the drab crowd. Children laugh, pointing at the apples spinning in the air. A small dog dances beside him, its paws tapping in time to a flute. Entertainment is rare, and everyone clings to it when it appears. For a few moments, hunger, fear, and duty vanish into applause. Not all the stalls sell joy. In one corner, a surgeon displays his tools on a blood-stained cloth, hooks, knives, and saws. He promises to set bones, pull teeth, or bleed away evil humours for the right price. Nearby, a woman sells charms against sickness, bits of ribbon, tiny wooden crosses, dried herbs tied with string, medicine and superstition side by side, and no one sees a contradiction. And everywhere there are sounds. The clang of a hammer, the cry of a rooster, the rhythmic thump of a weaver's shuttle, the music of survival echoing across centuries. As the afternoon deepens, the market changes, the noise softens, the shadows lengthen. Traders pack up their wares, counting coins with tired satisfaction. Children fall asleep against their mothers' skirts. The smell of roasted meat drifts from a tavern. You find yourself drawn toward the edge of the square, where an old man sits behind a small table of books, rare, precious things bound in leather and vellum. Most people pass him by. Only the church and the wealthy can read, and words, to most, are just symbols on dead skin. But he smiles as you approach. These, he says, his voice low and worn, are pieces of time. He opens one, and the inked letters gleam dark as the river under moonlight. The monks say every word written is a way to hold the world still, he adds. A kind of memory that won't decay. You think of everything you've seen, the monks and their bells, the pilgrims and their relics, the famine, the fire, the rain, all of it fragile, all of it fleeting. And, yet here, in his hands, the past survives. He closes the book and nods to you. Travel safely, he says, and remember the world changes slower than we think. Evening falls. The bells ring again, not for warning, not for worship, but for rest. The square empties, the fires dim, and one by one, shutters close over the glowing windows. The taverns hum softly, their laughter now low and warm. The streets, once alive with shouting, fill with the simple sounds of night, a dog barking, a wheel creaking, a door closing. You walk out of town as the last light fades. The sky above is deep blue, scattered with stars like frost on iron. Somewhere in the distance, you can still hear the river whispering, the eternal rhythm beneath everything. You think about the world you've walked through, the monks and the markets, the plagues and the prayers, the rules and the rebellions. How so many of their fears, their customs, their habits still live quietly inside us. The work hours, the blessings, the forks, the funerals. We've changed the clothes and the words, but not the rhythm. You pass a cottage window where a family sits at supper, the same soft glow you saw before, the same low murmur of voices, a loaf of bread, a pot of stew, the end of another long day. History may have moved on, but the pattern hasn't. We still chase comfort after chaos. We still end our days by the fire, trying to forget the storm outside. The road winds upward, toward a small hill overlooking the valley. From here, you can see the faint lights of villages scattered like embers below. The moon rises higher, turning the world to silver. For the first time, the air feels still. You sit down on a flat stone and listen to the wind, the faint song of crickets, the distant toll of a church bell marking the hour. The sound rolls through the night, gentle and familiar. The monk's rhythm still ticking away, century after century, even here, even now. You close your eyes and imagine all the lives still hidden in that darkness, the farmers, the mothers, the children asleep in wooden beds, the travellers still walking roads that never end, the world breathing in time with its own past. And as the sound of the bell fades, the night deepens around you. The candlelight of history flickers low. The story slows. Tomorrow, the bells will ring again. The market will open. Bread will bake. A new day will begin, just as it always has. But for now, rest. Let the fire fade to embers. Let the world fall silent. Because here, at the edge of the medieval night, everything finally comes to stillness. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the heartbeat of the past, steady and familiar, whispering through time. You were never as modern as you thought. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. If you've made it this far, thank you for sharing the candlelight with me. I hope you felt the echoes of the past flicker somewhere deep inside, that strange comfort of realizing the world has always been a little messy, a little magical, and a lot more familiar than we think. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through time, do me a small favor before you drift off, tap the like button. It helps more sleepy history lovers find their way here. And if you'd like to wander through another forgotten century with me next week, subscribe to Candlelit History. Leave a comment too, tell me where you're listening from, or which medieval rule surprised you most tonight. I read them all while the candles burn low. For now, close your eyes, let the night settle. The final 60 minutes are just black screen and the soft crackle of the candle. No more words, no more noise, just the sound of peace. Good night, traveller. You've walked far enough for one evening. This was Candlelit History.